Up until this point, this chapter has been focused on the various forms that Climate Crisis 101 takes. As the first two sections made clear, one of the central reasons for making the material available in all of these different forms was to make it as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. However, from the very beginning, Climate Crisis 101 was imagined as being a climate-friendly, environmentally sustainable course. In other words, this course was designed to have a small climate footprint. In fact, making the footprint as small as possible has become a bit of an obsession for me. So what prompted this obsession? Please allow me to again relate a personal story. Apologies in advance for doing so. In 2015, I learned that a third of the carbon footprint for the campus where I teach, the University of California at Santa Barbara, UCSB, came from air travel. This principally comes from flying staff and faculty to all sorts of conferences. All this air travel annually releases over 55 million pounds of CO2 or equivalent gases directly into the upper atmosphere, where it contributes most to the climate crisis. Once I got over the shock, I became a little obsessed with the climate impact of academic conferences and how they might be improved. Within a year, in May of 2016, we staged our first NCN, that stands for Nearly Carbon Neutral Conference at UCSB. Once it was over, we ran the numbers and realized that the carbon footprint for the event was less than 1% of its traditional fly-in counterpart. It was not, as you might imagine, a Zoom conference, but rather an unusual asynchronous event. Here's how it worked. 1. Speakers recorded their own talks and uploaded them online. 2. The conference was open for 3 weeks, during which time conference goers could watch any of the talks that they wanted at any time that they wanted. And 3, while the conference was open, participants contributed to an online Q&A session by posing and responding to written questions and comments. Why did I decide to experiment with this unusual approach? As I've noted in the past, being an admitted silver lining kind of guy, I try to think of the climate crisis as, well, something of an opportunity. Don't get me wrong, doing so isn't always easy, especially as I realize that countless beings, some human, most not, will suffer because of our rapidly and profoundly changing climate. I certainly wish that it wasn't happening. In that sense, I can actually sympathize with climate change deniers because this is such a horrific situation. It would be easy to slip into a state of denial and pretend that it wasn't happening and then vehemently defend that position. Seriously, I would sleep so much better if I could somehow convince myself that humanity was not at a crisis point. But as the climate crisis is real and, happening, and indeed is at a crisis point, it requires us to radically reconsider a range of cultural practices. It would be wonderful if there were technological fixes in the wings that would successfully mitigate the crisis without us having to raise a finger or make changes to our lives. However, as far as I am concerned, this is seductively wishful thinking. In short, if we hope to get through this, we need to change the way that we live and do things. However, the required changes need not necessarily be for the worst or even painful. Moreover, what if, in addition to climate change, we could also address a range of social injustices and cultural problems desperately in need of change? Returning to my NCN conferences, as I noted in the introductory practical guide to NCN conferences, quote, "The traditional conference has more than just environmental shortcomings. The cost of airfare from many low to middle income countries to anywhere in North America or Europe is often greater than the per capita income in those countries. Consequently, scholars from most of the world's countries and nearly the entire global South have long been quietly, summarily excluded from international conferences. Even in wealthy countries, like the U.S., conference participation is, owing to vagaries in funding, a privilege unequally shared." Close quote. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, as the traditional academic conference has additional glaring shortcomings. Consequently, our NCN conference approach was designed to, one, be generally more accessible to variously abled individuals than their traditional, conference counterparts. Two, to provide free and lasting access to all the cutting-edge material introduced at the event, which is similar to an open access journal. And three, allow participants from across the globe to equally take part, as comments can be made at any time in any time zone. The list doesn't stop there, but, you get the idea. In short, the idea was to stand back and take a look at the traditional academic conference in order to brainstorm ways of addressing its shortcomings, both environmental and cultural. However, as I noted in previous sections of this chapter, decades before I began thinking about how the academic conference might be reimagined. I was giving a great deal of thought to the classroom and how its surroundings might be, shortcomings might be addressed. So Climate Crisis 101 is my most recent effort at doing so. Consequently, I not only think of Climate Crisis 101 as akin to our NCN conferences, I think of it as an NCN, again, that's nearly carbon neutral, course. In rethinking both academic conferences and courses, my goal was the same, to make them more accessible and just, as well as more environmentally sound event. This may seem a little counterintuitive with respect to courses. After all, why use all of this technology needed for Climate Crisis 101? That's YouTube, an audio podcast series, an ebook, a website, when students could alternately just walk over to a lecture hall and hear me speak. Surely the traditional lecture must have a very tiny climate footprint. The problem here is getting students to campus in the first place, as international students make up 14% of UCSB's campus body. When I ask students to assess their individual climate footprints using an online calculator, many international students are surprised to learn that flying home 4 or 5 times per year is not only doubling their climate footprint, but in some cases tripling it, and even more. This is frustrating for more than international students, as their presence on campus benefits everyone. As I've long noted that if you took me to an unfamiliar campus but kept my eyes closed, I would still be able to tell you if I am in a truly great university. How? By listening for the different languages being spoken there. Truly great universities are international universities by virtue of the fact that they draw students from all over the planet. This is, as far as I am concerned, absolutely terrific. Until we think about the climate footprint of flying these students back and forth from campus and home, not only is all this air travel environmentally largely disastrous, but we are back to the same issue that I noted regarding travel to academic conferences. Please allow me to repeat what I just said regarding international conferences, but instead slightly revise it to reference international courses. The cost of airfare from many low and middle income countries to anywhere in North America or Europe is often greater than the per capita income of these countries. Consequently, students from most of the world's countries and nearly the entire global South have long been quietly, summarily excluded from international conferences and international education. This is a huge social justice issue, which is, as far as I am concerned, largely being ignored today. As with most social justice issues, this hurts everyone. True students who cannot afford the airfare, are obviously harmed. But in addition, we all lose out, as universities like UCSB are not being enriched by having these international students in our classes. Simply put, we are missing out on the opportunity to have a great deal of additional brain power in our classes. Moreover, having a range of international perspectives on an issue like the climate crisis would deeply enrich courses, and do deeply enrich courses like Climate Crisis 101. Consequently, Climate Crisis 101, as an NCN course, is designed to provide an equal experience to students and really anyone across the globe. Although I have repeatedly returned to this particular the particular way that I am teaching Climate Crisis 101, this is hardly, the only classroom experience possible. For example, not every student watching the lectures needs to be in the classroom. In this hybrid scenario, students in the lecture hall would watch the pre-recorded lecture material projected on screen in the room. At the same time, remote students would be able to watch the lecture and take part in the Q&A as a live webinar coming out of the computer playing the pre-recorded lecture. Hence, this would not be an asynchronous course, as all students will be watching the same lecture at the same time, regardless of their location. The difficulty here is that time zones present a problem. Simply put, regardless of whether, whenever a lecture is scheduled, it'll be in the middle of the night in some time zone. However, when we experimented with live NCN salons to complement our asynchronous NCN conferences, it became clear that some presentation times can work for a broad swath of the planet. Hence, as a UCSB course, Climate Crisis 101 is scheduled for 9:30 to 10:45 a.m., and that's Pacific Standard Time. This translates to a starting time of 12:30, a little after noon in New York City, 1:30 p.m. in Salvador, Brazil, 6:30 a.m. for London, 8:30 p.m. for Nairobi, 12:30 p.m. for New Delhi, and 12:30 a.m. for Beijing. I've incidentally geared this towards students who in my experience, tend to get up and go to bed a little later than I do. Thus, for some audiences, this time could be moved up a little. For example, a start time of 7:30 a.m. Translates into 10:30 p.m. in Beijing. In any event, even though careful timing can include most people on the globe, some people will inevitably be left out. 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time is 3:30 a.m. in Melbourne. In order to be truly inclusive and not privilege any one time zone, we need to shift to an asynchronous course. This is the approach taken by both our NCN conferences and by Climate Crisis 101 when it was taught during COVID. Since all of the lectures are pre-recorded and exist in a variety of forms, and students interact with YouTube comments, Climate Crisis 101 was easily adapted to asynchronous presentation during COVID. The one downside was this precluded a live Q&A while the lecture was being shown. However, it was easy enough to open up an online forum where students could post questions and comments, and, where I could also respond to them. And at a time of their choosing. So why take this unusual approach? It creates a course that has ultimate flexibility, as it can be done in person, as a hybrid, remotely, and if remotely, internationally as well. And to that, as well as it's geared toward asynchronous presentation. Okay, well, thank you.